Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. Mom, before we open presents, we need to talk about the house, my son said while the Christmas lights reflected softly against the crystal glasses on the dining table. I remember the exact way his fingers tapped against the wine glass as he spoke. Calm, casual, like he was asking me to pass the mashed potatoes instead of discussing the home I had spent 43 years building with his father. Outside, snow drifted quietly across the front yard, covering the old stone walkway Thomas had laid himself one summer when Michael was still in high school. The fireplace crackled behind us. Bing Crosby played softly from the kitchen speaker. Everything looked warm. Everything looked perfect. But I had lived long enough to know that warmth and love were not always the same thing. Vanessa adjusted the sleeve of her cream-colored sweater and smiled at me in that polished way she always did whenever money entered the conversation. "We're just trying to help you think ahead," she said gently. "This house is a lot for someone your age." Someone your age. I looked down at my plate for a moment. The roasted turkey had already gone cold. Nobody seemed to notice. Lauren sat across from me scrolling through real estate listings on her phone, not even pretending to hide it anymore. Every few minutes she would glance around the dining room with the careful eyes of someone mentally measuring square footage. The chandelier, the piano, the antique cabinet Thomas bought me during our anniversary trip to Vermont. They weren't looking at memories anymore. They were looking at assets. "Mom," Michael continued, leaning forward now, "we just think it would make sense to sell after the holidays. Split everything cleanly. It would make life easier for everyone. Easier for everyone." I almost smiled at that. Funny how people say everyone when they really mean themselves. I lifted my coffee cup slowly and stared into the dark reflection trembling inside it. Last Christmas, Michael barely stayed an hour before rushing off to another party. The Christmas before that, Lauren forgot to call until almost midnight. But tonight they were all here early, smiling, asking questions, refilling my wine glass before it was empty. Because tonight wasn't about Christmas. Tonight was about inventory. Vanessa reached over and touched my wrist lightly. "You know we only want what's best for you." Her perfume smelled expensive and sharp, like something sold behind glass counters in department stores. I remembered when she first joined the family 12 years ago. She used to bring homemade pies to Thanksgiving dinner and ask Thomas for advice about gardening. Somewhere along the way, warmth turned into calculation, so gradually I almost missed it happening. Almost. "Have you updated the will recently?" Lauren finally asked without looking up from her phone. There it was. Not even hidden anymore. Not wrapped politely beneath small talk and fake concern. Just laid bare in the center of the Christmas table beside the gravy bowl and candlelight. For a moment nobody spoke. The fire popped softly behind us. Snow brushed against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, an old floorboard creaked in the empty hallway. I looked at my children sitting beneath the glowing Christmas tree their father once decorated with such care, and something inside me became very still. I had spent decades believing sacrifice naturally created loyalty. That love, if given enough, returned home eventually. But sitting there at 72 years old, surrounded by my own family, I realized they weren't waiting for another Christmas memory. They were waiting for an ending. And for the first time in my life, I quietly began wondering what would happen if I stopped giving them exactly what they expected. The house always felt the coldest the morning after Christmas. I woke before sunrise and sat quietly at the kitchen table wrapped in Thomas's old gray cardigan while the coffee brewed slowly beside me. The living room still glowed faintly from the tree lights I forgot to turn off before bed. Half-opened presents sat scattered beneath the branches. Torn wrapping paper curled against the hardwood floor like dried leaves. Someone had left a wine glass beside the fireplace with lipstick still pressed against the rim. Vanessa's shade. Deep red. Expensive looking. I stared at it longer than I should have. Last night's conversation kept replaying in my mind with strange clarity. Not the words themselves. The expressions. Michael speaking carefully like a businessman handling a negotiation. Lauren avoiding eye contact whenever the subject turned too personal. Vanessa smiling every time the house came up in conversation. I stood slowly and began cleaning before the sun fully rose. It was habit more than energy. I folded blankets, gathered plates, wrapped untouched slices of pecan pie in aluminum foil. The turkey container barely looked touched at all. Thomas used to make 3 sandwiches the day after Christmas and insist they somehow tasted better than dinner itself. I could almost hear his laugh echoing faintly from the hallway when I opened the refrigerator. Funny how grief changes over time. In the beginning, it feels sharp enough to stop your breathing. Years later, it becomes quieter, like a room inside you that never fully warms again. Around 8:30, I noticed Michael forgot his scarf hanging over one of the dining room chairs. Dark navy cashmere. Probably cost more than my first car. I picked it up carefully and held it for a moment, remembering another winter long ago when he was 10 years old and refused to go outside unless I wrapped his little red scarf twice around his neck because he hated the wind touching his skin. Back then, he used to wait by the window for me to come home from work. Back then, I was still the center of his world instead of an obstacle standing between him and an inheritance. I carried the scarf upstairs intending to place it in the guest room before mailing it later in the week. That was when I passed by the slightly open bedroom door and noticed something sitting beside the bed. Vanessa's leather planner. She must have forgotten it in the rush to leave last night. I almost ignored it. I should have. But as I reached down to pick it up, several loose papers slipped onto the carpet. Real estate listings, nursing care brochures, handwritten notes with numbers circled aggressively in black ink, estimated market value, property taxes, renovation potential. One sentence near the bottom of the page caught my attention immediately. Convince Evelyn before spring market rises. I read it twice, then a third time. The house suddenly felt very quiet around me. Too quiet. Snow drifted softly outside the bedroom windows while somewhere downstairs the coffee machine clicked off automatically. I sat slowly on the edge of the guest bed with the papers trembling lightly in my hands. Not from anger. Not even from sadness anymore. It was something colder than that. Clarity. The kind that arrives late in life when every excuse finally runs out. I thought about all the little moments I ignored over the years. Vanessa asking detailed questions about my savings after Thomas died. Lauren suggesting smaller apartments every holiday. Michael insisting I should simplify my life while casually mentioning rising property values in the neighborhood. Piece by piece, the puzzle had quietly assembled itself while I kept pretending we were still a family held together by love instead of expectation. I carefully stacked the papers back inside the planner exactly as I found them. Then I placed the planner neatly on the dresser and walked downstairs without making a sound. The Christmas tree still glowed softly in the corner of the living room. Beautiful. Silent. Artificial. Somehow that felt fitting. The week after Christmas passed with an uncomfortable kind of quiet. Michael sent me 2 short text messages asking whether I had found his scarf, but he never asked how I was doing. Lauren mailed a thank you card for the cashmere sweater I bought her, although the handwriting looked rushed, almost distracted. Vanessa sent nothing at all. I notice these things now. Before, I used to excuse everything. People are busy. Families drift. Life gets complicated. That was the lie I had repeated to myself for years because accepting the truth felt far more painful. One snowy afternoon, I drove into town for groceries and found myself stopping outside the small church near Maple Street where Thomas and I used to volunteer during food drives every December. The parking lot was half full, and several people carried boxes through the side entrance while Christmas wreaths still hung slightly crooked on the brick walls. I do not know exactly why I pulled in. Maybe loneliness eventually pushes people toward familiar places the same way cold hands reach automatically toward warmth. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee, cinnamon, and wet winter coats. Volunteers moved quietly between folding tables stacked with canned soup and donated blankets. Nobody looked polished there. Nobody seemed interested in appearances. I stood awkwardly near the entrance for a moment before trying to lift a heavy cardboard box from the donation pile. "Careful, ma'am. That one weighs close to 40 pounds, a voice said gently beside me. I turned and saw a tall man wearing a dark green jacket dusted with snowflakes. Late 30s maybe. Kind eyes. Tired smile. He stepped forward before I could answer and lifted the box effortlessly onto his shoulder. "You must be Evelyn," he said. "Pastor Reed told me you used to help here with your husband." I blinked in surprise. "You knew Thomas?" "Only a little," he replied. But people still talk about him around here. Something in my chest tightened unexpectedly at those words. Not because they were dramatic. Quite the opposite. They were simple. Honest. It had been a long time since anyone spoke about Thomas without immediately connecting him to insurance papers, investments, or the house. "I am Noah Bennett," he said, offering his hand. His palm was cold from the weather outside. We spent the next hour sorting canned food together while snow continued drifting past the church windows. Noah told me he used to work as a firefighter before an injury forced early retirement from active duty. Now he helped coordinate community outreach programs around town. He spoke slowly, patiently, the way people do when they are actually listening instead of waiting for their turn to talk. At one point, I mentioned the antique ornaments decorating the church tree look similar to ones Thomas and I collected years ago during trips across New England. Noah stopped what he was doing and asked what our favorite town had been. Such a small question. Yet I realized halfway through my answer that nobody in my family had asked me about memories in years. They only asked about documents now. Numbers. Plans. Future arrangements. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Noah carried my grocery bags to the car without me asking. The wind had become sharper by then, and ice crackled beneath our shoes across the parking lot. "You should be careful driving tonight," he said while placing the final bag in my trunk. "Roads freeze fast after sunset." I smiled faintly. "You sound exactly like Thomas." Noah laughed softly. Then he must have been a smart man. For the first time since Christmas dinner I laughed too. Only for a second. Only quietly. But it surprised me enough that I sat inside the car afterward with my hands resting against the steering wheel long after Noah disappeared back inside the church. Outside, snow covered the town in a clean white silence. And somewhere deep inside me, something frozen for a very long time shifted ever so slightly. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to the church more often than I planned. At first, I told myself it was simply to stay busy through the rest of winter. The house had become too quiet after the holidays, and silence has a way of growing heavier when there is nobody left to share it with. But somewhere beneath that excuse was another truth I did not want to admit too quickly. I liked being somewhere people still looked at one another with kindness instead of calculation. One Thursday afternoon, I arrived carrying 2 large containers of homemade chicken soup, while freezing rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows. Noah was already there arranging donated coats by size across long folding tables. He looked up when I walked in and smiled in a way that felt genuine and unforced. "You keep feeding this place and people are going to stop going home," he joked as he took the containers from my hands. "Thomas used to say the same thing," I replied before I could stop myself. Noah paused for a moment. "Then he sounds like he had good taste too." I laughed quietly and began helping sort canned goods beside him. It surprised me how natural conversation felt around Noah. There were no hidden motives buried beneath his questions. No careful steering toward bank accounts or legal paperwork. He asked about ordinary things. What kind of music Thomas and I danced to when we were younger. Whether the old maple tree outside my house had always leaned slightly to the left. Which pie recipe my grandchildren loved most before they became too busy to visit. Small questions. Human questions. I had almost forgotten how comforting they could feel. One evening after volunteering, Noah drove over to help me fix the porch light that had been flickering for months. Michael kept promising to stop by and look at it, but somehow work emergencies and business dinners always got in the way. Noah climbed the ladder carefully while cold winds swept through the neighborhood carrying the sharp scent of snow. "There," he said a few minutes later as warm yellow light spread across the porch again. "Now nobody has an excuse for missing your front steps." I smiled faintly while pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders. Nobody visits much anymore. The words escaped more honestly than I intended. Noah climbed down slowly and looked toward the quiet street lined with glowing porch decorations left over from Christmas. "That says more about them than it does about you," he said softly. I looked away before answering. Because at my age, kindness can sometimes hurt more than cruelty. Cruelty confirms what you already fear. Kindness reminds you how long it has been missing. A few days later, Michael finally called. His voice sounded distracted, rushed between meetings. "Hey Mom. Vanessa mentioned you have been spending time over at the church a lot lately." I stirred cream into my coffee slowly. I volunteer there sometimes. That is good, he replied quickly. Then after a pause he added, You are not giving money away over there or anything, right? I stared quietly at the snow gathering along the backyard fence while his question settled heavily between us. Not are you happy? Not are you lonely? Not even do you need anything? Just money. Always circling back to money. No, I answered calmly. I am simply helping people. He exhaled in relief so quietly he probably thought I would not notice. But I did. Mothers always notice. After we hung up, I remained sitting at the kitchen table long after the coffee turned cold. The afternoon light faded slowly across the countertops while the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily in the background. I thought about the difference between obligation and love. One demands, the other gives freely. Somewhere over the years my children had confused inheritance with devotion. And perhaps I had helped create that confusion by giving too much for too long without ever asking what remained underneath it all. That night, before bed, I stood by the living room window watching snow drift softly beneath the restored porch light Noah had fixed. The warm glow stretched across the empty driveway where Thomas used to park his truck after work every evening. For the first time in months, the house no longer felt abandoned. But it also no longer felt like something I needed to protect for the sake of people who had already emotionally left it behind. By February, the snow around the neighborhood had hardened into gray piles along the sidewalks, and the world outside my windows looked tired of winter. I understood the feeling. Some mornings I still woke expecting to hear Thomas moving around downstairs making coffee before sunrise. Other mornings I woke with an uncomfortable sense of clarity that settled heavier with each passing week. Once you finally see people clearly, it becomes impossible to return to the softer version of them you carried in your heart for years. One Saturday afternoon, Michael and Vanessa stopped by unexpectedly. Vanessa carried a bakery box from the expensive place downtown that charged $8 for cupcakes decorated like tiny works of art. Michael brought nothing except his phone and the restless energy he always carried lately. Thought we would check in on you, he said while kissing my cheek quickly before glancing around the living room. His eyes moved the way realtors inspect open houses. Quiet. Measuring. Vanessa set the desserts on the kitchen counter and smiled warmly. Your house always feels so cozy this time of year. I thanked her and poured coffee for everyone while snow flurries drifted outside the windows. For nearly 20 minutes they talked about harmless things. Traffic. Rising grocery prices. Some couple they knew getting divorced in Connecticut. It almost felt normal. Almost. Then Michael casually leaned back in his chair and asked, So how is that church volunteer thing going? It is nice, I answered. People there actually enjoy helping each other. The sentence slipped out before I could soften it. Vanessa's smile tightened slightly around the edges. That is sweet, she said carefully. You just have to be careful. Some people take advantage of older women living alone. I stirred my coffee slowly without responding. Michael exchanged a quick glance with her before speaking again. Especially if strangers start getting too involved. There it was. Not concern. Suspicion. Possession disguised as protection. Noah helped fix my porch light, I replied calmly. He is a good man. Silence settled over the kitchen table for half a second too long. Then Vanessa laughed lightly. Well, free labor is always nice. I looked directly at her for the first time since they arrived. Kindness is nice too. She lowered her eyes immediately and reached for her coffee cup. Michael changed the subject after that, but the atmosphere never fully recovered. The warmth became performative. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every compliment sounded transactional. Later that afternoon, while I carried empty dessert plates toward the kitchen, I realized I had forgotten my reading glasses upstairs. As I passed near the hallway, I heard voices drifting softly from the dining room where Michael and Vanessa thought I was out of earshot. You need to talk to her before this gets worse, Vanessa whispered sharply. I am trying, Michael replied. But if she starts trusting outsiders, we could lose control of everything. My hand tightened around the edge of the plate. Then stop being soft about it, Vanessa continued. The sooner she downsizes, the sooner this entire situation becomes manageable. Manageable. I stood perfectly still in the hallway while their words settled into me with strange calmness. Not because they shocked me anymore. That part was already over. This moment simply confirmed what my heart had been resisting for months. I was no longer their mother. No longer family. I had become an estate plan with a pulse. Just keep her emotional until the paperwork is done, Vanessa said quietly. After that, it will not matter. The plate in my hands remained steady. So did my breathing. Somewhere in the kitchen, the dishwasher hummed softly while wind rattled the bare tree branches outside. I stared at the family photos lining the hallway wall. Birthday parties. Beach vacations. Christmas mornings from decades ago when Michael still grinned with missing front teeth. And Lauren used to fall asleep beside Thomas on the couch after opening presents. Looking at those pictures now felt like visiting strangers I once knew intimately. I walked calmly back into the kitchen before they noticed I had heard anything. Then I placed the dessert plates beside the sink and quietly poured myself another cup of coffee, while something deep inside me finally stopped breaking and started hardening instead. The following Monday morning, I drove downtown beneath a sky the color of cold steel and parked outside the law office Thomas and I had used for nearly 30 years. The sign above the entrance still read Parker and Wells in faded gold lettering, although Mr. Parker himself had passed away almost a decade earlier. Some things remain out of habit long after the people connected to them disappear. I understood that feeling more than ever lately. Inside, the office smelled faintly of leather folders, coffee, and old paper. The receptionist greeted me warmly and offered tea while I waited. A younger version of myself would have felt nervous sitting there alone discussing wills and property arrangements. But age changes fear. Eventually, exhaustion replaces it, and clarity becomes easier than denial. Mrs. Carter, Jonathan Wells said gently as he entered the waiting room a few minutes later. He looked older than I remembered. More gray around the temples. Reading glasses hanging low against his collar. It has been too long. That usually means life has been peaceful, I replied with a faint smile. He led me into his office where winter light filtered softly through tall windows overlooking Main Street. Framed law degrees covered one wall beside photographs of fishing trips and grandchildren. Ordinary reminders that people still built real lives outside contracts and signatures. Jonathan sat across from me and folded his hands carefully. What can I help you with today? For a moment, I looked down at my wedding ring resting against the edge of the desk. I still wore it sometimes even after all these years. Not because I could not move on, but because Thomas had been the last person who truly made this house feel like home instead of property. I would like to change my will, I said calmly. Jonathan's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise exactly. More caution. All right, he answered carefully. We can certainly discuss that. I took a slow breath before continuing. I want the majority of my estate transferred into a charitable trust after my death. He blinked once behind his glasses. A trust connected to the church outreach program? Yes. I folded my gloves neatly in my lap. Food assistance. Housing support. Community services. And your children? He asked gently. The question hung quietly between us. I stared past him toward the snowy street outside where people hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases through the cold. My children have spent years preparing for my death, I said softly. I would rather spend what remains of my life helping people who still understand the value of kindness. Jonathan remained silent for several seconds before nodding slowly. And the house? I looked down at my hands again. The same hands that painted nursery walls, wrapped Christmas gifts at midnight, stitched Halloween costumes, balanced household budgets, and held my husband's fingers during his final hours in hospice care. Every corner of that house carried pieces of an entire lifetime, but memories lose meaning when the people inheriting them no longer respect what created them. I want the house transferred into trust. Management as well, I replied, with residential rights and oversight assigned to Noah Bennett. Jonathan adjusted his glasses carefully. The volunteer coordinator? Yes. Forgive me for asking, Evelyn, but are you absolutely certain about this decision? I smiled then. Small. Tired. Honest. For the first time in years. He studied my face quietly before opening a legal folder on his desk. Then let us make sure everything is done properly. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Signatures. Amendments. Beneficiary clauses. Charitable allocations. calm administrative language used to redirect the emotional weight of an entire family legacy. Yet strangely, I did not feel grief while signing the papers. I felt lighter. Not happy. Not vindictive. Simply relieved. Like someone finally setting down a suitcase they had carried far beyond exhaustion. When I stepped back outside, snow had started falling again in slow drifting patterns across downtown storefronts. I stood on the sidewalk pulling my coat tighter around myself while cold wind brushed against my face. For the first time in a very long while, the future no longer belonged to people waiting impatiently for my absence. It belonged to me. Spring arrived slowly that year. Snow melted into cold rain, and the flower beds Thomas once cared for began pushing small patches of green through the damp earth outside the house. Life continued the way it always does, even when families quietly fall apart behind closed doors. By late November, Christmas decorations had already started appearing in storefront windows downtown. Garland wrapped around street lamps. Artificial snow sprayed across bakery windows. Holiday music playing too early in grocery stores. I used to love that season more than any other time of year. Now it felt different. Softer somehow. Like watching a memory instead of living inside it. Around the second week of December, Michael called unexpectedly cheerful. "We were thinking this year should be special," he said. "A real family Christmas. Like old times." I stood in the kitchen stirring soup while rain tapped gently against the windows. "That sounds lovely," I answered evenly. "Lauren is bringing the kids," he continued. "Vanessa already ordered catering. We thought everybody could stay late and exchange gifts together." The effort in his voice sounded almost rehearsed. Too polished. Too eager. But I agreed anyway. Sometimes people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are close to getting what they want. The week before Christmas, packages began arriving at my house almost daily. Gourmet chocolates from Lauren. A thick cashmere blanket from Michael and Vanessa. Expensive scented candles with little gold ribbons tied around them. Strange how generosity suddenly appears when people grow nervous about losing access to something valuable. I thanked them politely each time. I smiled during phone calls. I played my role perfectly. By Christmas Eve, the house looked exactly the way Thomas used to love. White lights wrapped around the staircase. Fresh pine garland draped above the fireplace. Silver ornaments reflecting softly against the windows after dark. I even baked cinnamon rolls from scratch that morning using the same recipe my children grew up eating every holiday. Some habits survive heartbreak because they belong to who you are, not to the people who failed you. Michael and Vanessa arrived first carrying wrapped gifts and bottles of wine that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week. Vanessa hugged me tightly at the door. Too tightly. "You look wonderful," she said brightly while scanning the living room behind me. Lauren arrived 20 minutes later with the grandchildren, who immediately disappeared upstairs toward the game room without speaking more than 2 sentences to me. Teenagers now. Taller every year. Further away too. Dinner itself felt almost beautiful on the surface. Candles flickering softly. Jazz music playing low in the background. Snow beginning to fall outside again just after sunset. Everyone laughing slightly louder than normal. Complimenting the food too often. Asking careful questions about my health, my schedule, whether I had been keeping busy. Every word carried invisible weight beneath it. I noticed Michael watching me whenever Noah's name accidentally came up in conversation. Noticed Vanessa stiffen slightly when I mentioned volunteering at the shelter expansion project downtown. And I noticed how quickly Lauren changed the subject anytime legal paperwork or future plans drifted too close to the table. They knew something had shifted. They just did not know exactly what. After dinner, while the grandchildren played upstairs and Christmas music drifted softly through the house, Michael offered to help me carry dessert plates into the kitchen. The moment we were alone, his expression changed subtly. Not cruel, just cautious. "Mom," he said quietly while drying a wine glass with a dish towel, "you know we only want what is best for you, right?" I continued stacking plates calmly beside the sink. "Of course." He hesitated before speaking again. "People around town have been talking." There it was. I looked at him without answering. "About you spending time with that Noah guy," he continued carefully. "I just hope you are not letting strangers influence important decisions." Important decisions. Such delicate wording for a conversation about inheritance. I smiled faintly and rinsed another plate beneath warm water. Michael, I said softly, sometimes strangers treat us with more kindness than family does. His face tightened almost instantly, only for a second, but I saw it. Fear. Real fear. And for the first time in many years, I realized the balance of power inside this family had quietly changed without any of them noticing. 3 months later, the funeral flowers had already begun to wilt by the church altar while people spoke in hushed voices beneath gray spring skies outside. Rain tapped softly against the stained glass windows during the service, and the entire town seemed wrapped in that quiet heaviness that follows the passing of someone who spent most of their life taking care of others. I had known this day would come eventually. Age teaches you that every goodbye is simply waiting for its turn. Yet nothing prepared Michael and Lauren for the fact that I had prepared for it too. After the funeral reception ended, Jonathan Wells asked the family to meet at his office the following morning for the reading of my estate documents. Vanessa arrived wearing a cream-colored coat and dark sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. Michael barely looked at anyone as he walked through the office lobby carrying his phone and car keys. Lauren appeared nervous in the careful way people do when they are trying to seem calm while mentally counting outcomes. Noah sat quietly near the far side of the conference room wearing the same dark jacket he always wore during volunteer work at the church. He looked uncomfortable being there at all. Jonathan cleared his throat gently and opened the folder resting in front of him. The room smelled faintly of coffee and rainwater from damp umbrellas leaning near the doorway. Outside, traffic moved slowly along Main Street beneath overcast skies. Mrs. Evelyn Carter updated her estate plan approximately 14 months ago, Jonathan began carefully. I could almost picture Michael straightening in his chair at those words. 14 months ago. Right around the time everything changed. Jonathan continued reading in his calm professional voice while silence slowly thickened inside the room. Charitable trust allocations. Housing assistance programs. Community outreach funding. Donations to the church shelter expansion project. Vanessa frowned first. Then Lauren. Michael remained expressionless, but his jaw tightened slightly more with every sentence. The Carter residence, Jonathan continued, along with all operational oversight of the associated charitable housing initiative, has been placed under trust administration with supervisory responsibility assigned to Mr. Noah Bennett. Silence. Complete silence. Even the rain outside seemed quieter for a moment. Vanessa finally spoke first. Excuse me. Jonathan adjusted his glasses calmly. Mr. Bennett has been designated as acting residential and operational trustee under the terms outlined here. Who the hell is Noah Bennett? Vanessa snapped while turning sharply toward him. Noah looked stunned himself. I did not know about any of this, he said quietly. Michael leaned forward suddenly. This has to be some kind of misunderstanding. Jonathan remained perfectly composed. I assure you it is not. Lauren stared down at the polished conference table while her fingers trembled lightly around a paper cup of untouched coffee. She left almost everything away, she whispered. Jonathan paused briefly before opening another envelope from the folder. Mrs. Carter also requested that a personal letter be read aloud following the formal proceedings. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Jonathan unfolded the letter carefully, and for the first time since entering that room, the atmosphere shifted from shock into something far heavier. Grief mixed with realization. To my children, he began reading softly. If you are hearing this, then I hope one day you understand that love cannot survive where kindness no longer exists. I spent many years confusing obligation with family, and I ignored loneliness because I believed sacrifice automatically created loyalty. I was wrong. Michael lowered his eyes slowly toward the floor. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly without speaking. A stranger showed me more compassion in one winter than my own children showed me in years, Jonathan continued. Not because he wanted something from me, but because kindness was simply part of who he was. I do not leave behind these decisions out of anger. I leave them behind out of clarity. The room remained absolutely still after Jonathan finished reading. No arguments came. No dramatic speeches. Just silence heavy enough to expose every selfish conversation, every calculated visit, every holiday smile built around inheritance instead of love. Outside the office windows, Rain continued falling softly across Main Street while Noah sat frozen in quiet disbelief, and my children finally faced the one thing they never expected from me. Not revenge. Consequence. The following December, snow began falling again just after sunset, covering the neighborhood in the same quiet white stillness that once filled the old Carter house every Christmas season. But this year, the house no longer felt frozen in memory. Warm light glowed through every front window while laughter drifted softly across the porch and out into the cold evening air. Inside, the dining room table was crowded with volunteers from the shelter, elderly widows from the church community, and several families who had recently moved into temporary housing through the outreach program Evelyn helped fund before she passed away. Children sat cross-legged near the fireplace drinking hot chocolate, while paper snowflakes hung from the staircase banister beside the same silver ornaments Thomas and Evelyn collected decades earlier during their trips through New England. Noah stood quietly in the kitchen rinsing coffee mugs while jazz music played softly through the house speakers. Sometimes he still expected Evelyn to walk slowly into the room wearing that gray cardigan and carrying another tray of cinnamon rolls fresh from the oven. Grief does not disappear when someone dies. It simply learns how to sit beside love without speaking so loudly all the time. Earlier that afternoon, Noah had opened the small wooden box Jonathan Wells delivered after the estate proceedings months ago. Inside rested several old photographs, Thomas's wedding watch, and one final handwritten letter addressed only to him. The paper smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Dear Noah, the letter began in Evelyn's careful handwriting. If you are reading this, then I imagine the house is probably full again. I hope so. Homes were never meant to sit quietly waiting for people who only arrive when they need something. Noah paused then, staring out the kitchen window while snow collected against the backyard fence. The porch light he fixed nearly 2 years earlier still glowed warmly across the driveway every night. He continued reading slowly. I spent too many years believing family was measured by blood, obligation, or shared names. But toward the end of my life, I finally understood something Thomas tried to teach me long ago. Family is built by the people who make you feel less alone. In the living room, one of the little girls staying at the shelter laughed loudly, while showing another child how to hang popcorn garland around the tree. The sound echoed gently through the house. Alive. Real. You gave me dignity during a season when I felt invisible inside my own home. The letter continued. You listened when nobody else noticed I had stopped speaking. That kindness mattered more than you will ever fully understand. Noah lowered the letter briefly and rubbed his eyes before continuing. Please do not let this house become a monument to grief or bitterness. Fill it with noise. Fill it with people who need warmth. Fill it with second chances. That is all I ever truly wanted in the end. A few minutes later, Noah folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the wooden box before walking toward the front hallway. Outside, snow continued drifting softly beneath the porch light while cars lined the street from guests arriving for dinner. Through the windows, the old house glowed brighter than it had in years. Not because of expensive decorations or polished holiday perfection, because it finally held something genuine again. Noah stepped onto the porch for a moment and looked out across the quiet neighborhood, while cold winter air filled his lungs. Then he reached over and switched on the second lantern beside the front door, just as Evelyn used to do every Christmas Eve before Thomas came home from work. Warm golden light spilled across the snow-covered walkway, stretching gently into the darkness beyond the gate. And for the first time in a very long time, the Carter house no longer waited for people counting the value of what stood inside it. It welcomed people grateful simply to be there. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.